You could be forgiven for thinking that social justice was losing the culture war if you gauge that battle by reference to social media platforms such as this one, where social justice talking points are routinely ridiculed, satirised and debunked. But if you get out from behind the computer screen and take a look at what's happening on university campuses and in our public and private institutions, you get a completely different picture. Now, I've been harping on about the cult of diversity for some time now, and whilst it's easy to expose the bankruptcy of those ideas, it continues to roll on, basically unchallenged. Even Donald Trump is getting in on the act, signing into law a bill that is pushing for more women in STEM fields. And here in Australia, the diversity train has the blessing of both sides of politics. Last Sunday on The Outsiders, Rowan Dean gave an excellent rundown on the diversity infection in some of our public institutions here in Australia.
Well, speaking of Martin Parkinson, I think we should... Ross Cameron last week. Now, I had so many people, Ross, telling me what a brilliant job you did last week. It was absolutely sensational.
Sorry.
And I concur with this.
I didn't quite get that.
Brilliant job.
Yes,
absolutely
yes,
concur.
Thank you.
You were legendary in that you explained to... viewers, this whole concept of unconscious bias and how what is happening within not only the public service, but it's extremely damaging in the public service, but elsewhere, is this idea that leaders now believe that they have an unconscious bias against straight white men, so they have to overcome that unconscious bias in favour of them by voting against them or choosing someone who isn't like them. So we have the public service, we have banks, we have airlines, we have big corporations all going out of their way to choose the person who's not as good as the straight white male for the job in order to combat their unconscious bias. We call this Parkinson's disease because it is rife throughout the public service, it's rife throughout industry, and you, the taxpayer, you, the shareholder, and you, the consumer, are sitting there knowing that at least 33% of the decisions made in employing people go to the wrong person. I worked this out because if two people are in a room vying for the same job, either one of them is more qualified than the other or they're both qualified the same. But according to Martin Parkinson, you should not look at the one who is most qualified because that is called perceived merit. They're not actually better, it's just perceived merit. And you should go for the one who fits either gay, lesbian, trans, Muslim, African, Asian, woman, whatever, because that's the way you combat your unconscious bias. So Parkinson's disease is rife throughout the public service.
And just to clear that up, if you're not following, Martin Parkinson is the head of the Australian Public Service and draws a taxpayer-funded salary of $861,000. And he's decided that the Australian Treasury Department has too many men. And that has something to do with unconscious bias that favours men. And so he's going to rectify that by hiring more women, even though only 25% of economics graduates in Australia are women. That's Parkinson's disease for you.
First of all, Philip Lowe, head of the Reserve Bank of Australia, he actually told us that he prides himself on his battling his unconscious bias, which he did, Mark, I believe, when his 15-year-old daughter challenged him about the role of women in the Reserve Bank, and he caved and said, yeah, absolutely. I have no idea. I must be a victim of unconscious bias as well.
Well, it's amazing. This is a real insider's job. The Governor of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe, has said that his 15-year-old daughter came home from school one day with the burning question, what was he doing to make sure women have equal chances at the central bank? Her concern, the daughter of the Reserve Bank, one of those privileged households in the country, her concern wasn't about poor or disadvantaged people, it was about people like her. And Lowe has taken this up to say he won't be making appointments strictly on merit, he'll be shoehorning women in. He acknowledges that even though women are 60% of the university graduates, they haven't got a big number of economic graduates, but he's going to shoehorn the women in solely on the basis of what his daughter said. And he lists four here, Lucy Ellis, Michelle Bullock, Alexandra Heath and Marion Kohler, who've been given jobs other than on merit. It's just because of the shape of their genitalia. Now,
and let's not forget,
this daughter is getting a bigger say about employment policy at this taxpayer-funded institution than any Australian voter. Absolute insider's job.
So a 15-year-old girl came home from school and got her father, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, to implement diversity hiring at the RBA. Now, where do you think she got that from? You see, this is why our schools continue to fall behind the rest of the world, because some clueless teacher put the women are oppressed narrative in this kid's head instead of teaching the basics.
And let's not forget, Mark, that the Reserve Bank of Australia sets all your interest rates and decides whether you can afford your mortgage, what sort of house you live in, and so on. So we now know that the people at the Reserve Bank who will be doing the job in the future are not as good as the ones that could have been done it, as you pointed out last week. The history of Treasury, same thing. Treasury did a great job in the past. It's not going to do as good a job in the future because it's not employing people who have the right qualifications. But let's move on. There's plenty of people suffering from Parkinson's disease. Andrew Colvin of the Australian Federal Police. He's come out. He reckons there's been a 200-year systemic bias against women. And he's decided that from now on he's going to change all that. And there's a deeply entrenched organisational cultural problem with the police that's gone on for years, if not decades. So all that's going to go out the window. He's made a rock-solid, Andrew Colvin made a rock-solid commitment to gender equity. So presumably he's drinking the unconscious bias Kool-Aid to make sure that he no longer has any unconscious bias. He also denies that he has been captured by feminist extremists. I guess we'll have to make up our own mind on that. But he's happy to be compared with David Morrison. David Morrison,
really?
You will remember. So Andrew Colvin, head of the police, is happy to be compared with senior military officers, so I presume he means David Morrison, who are also on this gender equality bandwagon and who are also wandering around telling people who you should employ based on, as you said, their genitalia or their race rather than their qualifications. So we have him. We move on. Look, there's no end to Parkinson's disease. We have Ian Narev, head of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Ian is, on Monday, a mate of mine who works in the Commonwealth Bank sent me a copy of an email. Every Monday morning, Ian Narev sends out an email to all the staff at the Commonwealth Bank, millions of them. This last week, he said, "This week we are celebrating cultural diversity. I am pleased that so many of you are involved in a taste of harmony. I am participating in the first Leadership Council on Cultural Diversity." So if you're with the Commonwealth Bank, this is the bloke in charge of your money. He's very concerned about being a member of the Leadership Council on Cultural Diversity, which includes such luminaries as Dr. Tim Soup Parmesan, the Race Discrimination Commissioner. So at the CBA, they're also busily employing people not on merit, but on any kind of cultural diversity criteria. Moving on, we have Michael Pizzulo, Department of Immigration head, another public servant who he was grilled recently over $250 million being spent on new headquarters for the Immigration Department. He was questioned in the Senate about you're paying the maximum rate that you could pay for a lease in Canberra. Why are you paying that top rate? To which he answered that the proposed new office accommodation will be of a modern design, that's great, to promote collaboration and positive cultural renewal. Here we have it again. The head of the Department of Immigration is focusing on cultural diversity, culture, positive renewal, all this sort of stuff. And when I looked up precisely what he might mean by cultural diversity, we find out that immigration boss Michael Pizzulo called for an insurgency and revolution for women leaders to take on, again, the same idea. The men who have been doing the job in the immigration aren't good enough. Get rid of them, and let's bring in some women who may not have the same qualifications, or some lesbians, or some trans, or whatever else, because we have to...
Didn't he say that the women need to speak up for themselves at meetings? That's the insurgency?
Yes, exactly.
You know what I wonder about these palookas? What sort of women have they got in their own lives? Who are they hanging out with? All the women in my life are strong, vibrant, confident. They must be hanging out with a bunch of handmaidens.
No lack of female counsel in my life, I can promise you that. I do want to take up this point that Rowan makes. I think where citizens are at most risk is when you get the male who still wants to occupy the top job on the top money. He feels this sense of guilt that he's got to compensate for, so he throws himself with ever more gusto into sort of signalling to everybody else that even though I know I'm a male, even though I know I'm the wrong gender, even though I know I'm the white problem that we're trying to solve, I'm going to keep my job, but the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to smear all of the other males, I'm going to discover the bells in my brain, the unconscious bias, and I'm going to go on the systematic campaign to find it under every manila folder I pick up. I'm going to find.
And Ross Cameron absolutely nails it. These are all men in positions of power having drunk the Kool-Aid of diversity, and they now feel the need to assuage their feelings of guilt by throwing a whole generation of young males under the diversity bus. Now, I'd actually have more respect for them if they resigned from their jobs and gave it to a woman. If you're going to talk the talk, walk the walk. This is no different from J.K. Rowling shaming everyone into taking more refugees while leaving her several mansions empty. It's hypocrisy, it's cowardly, and if I were a young man in Australia today, I'd be taking names because these are the people that are selling out your future just to make themselves feel better.
That's the hazard to us.
And it's worse than that, Ross, because a lot of these companies now employ diversity and inclusion officers, D&I officers, which we've talked about before.
Can you imagine that job? It would be hell. Getting out of bed, getting on the bus. What do you do?
Their role is to monitor the choices that other individuals in the organisation make about who they are employing. So there is now an incentive, both the fear that you might lose your own job if you don't battle at those bells, battle that unconscious bias. Yes. So there's that danger. But also you have to be seen. It's not good enough to just choose people not on merit. You have to be seen to be doing so. So as I said, 33% of at least 33% of all employments being made under D&I inspired hirings, the person is doing a less good job than the bloke who is now unemployed. That's what's happening across banks, across institutions, and it's so dangerous in the public service. And I hope at least the airlines are employing pilots who know how to fly rather than on perceived merit of how they look.
I could save corporate Australia and corporate America and the entire corporate sector of the Western world millions of dollars overnight. Fire all diversity officers. They create no value whatsoever. Their entire role is just to be the thought and behaviour police in the workplace. A total waste of money.
Well, Rowan, you've missed one. Last week was actually Cultural Diversity Week, and this diversity clam bake included Tim Soutphommasane from the Human Rights Commission getting together with leading law firms in Sydney, and one of the partners there at Baker McKenzie, Chris Freeland, made the remarkable comment, "We've found an error in ourselves and we don't like what we see." Poor bugger's found out he's white. And what he's concluded is that, inspired by Dr. Tim, because 10% of the population has an Asian background, 10% of the senior lawyers should also be Asian. So Soutphommasane is racing around now establishing racial quotas at law firms. Now, does he understand the exploding cigar that he's smoking here, Ross? Because if you're going to have a racial quota, we can point out that the elite selective government schools in Sydney, James Roos, North Sydney Boys and Girls, Hurlston, that Tim went to, are 90% Asian. So if you're going to apply a racial quota there, you've got to kick 80% of the students out to get down to 10. So too, a very high proportion of doctors and university students are Asian in Australia. I think that's great. If people are achieving these things on merit, great. But if you're going to start employing racial quotas, especially in selective high schools, 80% of the Asians are out. Dr. Tim, you are an absolute imbecile. This is self-defeating. You're smoking the exploding cigar and you've got to wake up to yourself. This is just dumb, dumb, dumb.
Well, let me just say I totally agree with you, and all those consumers out there, shareholders, investors and taxpayers, when you see the words diversity and inclusion, you know that it's basically sexism/racism against straight white males. So you might want to think about whether you want to put your money there.
And that's exactly right. And honestly, I'm sick of talking about it. The only way you're going to stop the march of the diversity ideologues is to make it costly for companies to push that line. The government sector, of course, doesn't pay a price. They can discriminate all they want, and it's all on the taxpayer's dime. So unless people start to speak up and take action, we're going to lose this battle. So write letters, complain, boycott companies, change service providers, and vote against this crap and send a message. Otherwise, we will lose this battle against social justice. So if you have any thoughts about how we can stop the march of social justice from infecting every part of our everyday lives, drop them in the comments below. and I'll see you next time.